Well, it's 1 o'clock, and so I want to get started on time. I know we have a lot to cover. I want to really welcome everyone to the last of our 4 sessions on psychological first aid. We're very excited that you have participated and hope you found it as beneficial and interesting as we have. Uh, Wanted to start today by passing off to Joe Williams, who will be starting us today and introduce the rest of our team, Erin Hembrick and Alyssa Maris and Alice Shum. So Joe, I'll let you take it away. Well, I hope Joe is there. As anyone's, I don't know, Erin, if you want to start us out, and hopefully Joe will join us in a second.
Yeah, that sounds good. I am certain he's on his way, especially because I haven't gotten a text from him, which I usually get if he's going to be late. All right, so yes, like Robert was saying, this is our fourth and final session of psychological first aid. If you could go on to the next slide. And same as all the other weeks, we don't have anything to disclose. And in fact, one of the best parts about psychological first aid is that there are free online trainings. There's a free psychological first aid app available in the Apple App Store and also on Google Play that I would encourage those of you who have access to those resources to download because the data or the information is organized really nicely within the app. And so again, we don't have any financial interest to disclose and are excited to be able to train you all in this great approach. So if you could go to the next slide. And again, we are providing kind of the evidence as we know it within the field. Next slide. And as usual, after the session, we will send the slides and the chat log over to you all. Today, you will also be receiving a psychological first aid post survey. We have done our best to make it very, very short and sweet, but this is the first time that we have done this training in this format. And so we are very interested in your perceptions of how it went. So if you would please fill that out when it comes your way. Really pretty soon today after the training, you'll have access to that survey. And I also want to put in a plug for kind of the step 2 of this training, which is going to also be on Wednesdays from 1 to 3 p.m. And it's going to start July 21st. So it'll run the 4-week span from July 21st to August 4th. SPR is very similar to PFA in that it is also developed for kind of early response. But if you remember back to some of the previous trainings, PFA is really for the early hours, days, and weeks. SPR is really great from about week 2 to week 6. So it's still preventive. It's still an intervention that can be delivered by a wide range of individuals, not just individuals with specific licenses, but it is a deeper dive. And so we would encourage those of you who've enjoyed this, but really want to know more to join us on that training series as well. So with that, I think I see Joa has popped up in my screen, so I will pass it over to him.
All right, thanks, Erin. And hi, everyone. I'm glad to see everybody back here again for the final session in our PFA Echo series. So thanks, everyone. And we're looking forward to, again, covering some, I think, essential sort of core actions that I think you'll often find are going to be very, very useful, particularly in post-disaster and post-trauma kinds of contexts. So we'll talk a little bit today about information on coping, how we can sort of help people cope with some of the emotional distress that can be particularly overwhelming for survivors in the immediate aftermath of a trauma or disaster, and then talk about how we can link folks to additional supports and additional services. And I think that's often one of the most important outcomes we can really sort of pursue and hope for with these kinds of early interventions, is to make sure folks not only find that immediate contact helpful in terms of, just trying to help alleviate the intensity of acute distress find information on coping, help get linked to additional supports, but also have a good plan for what next. Where do I go next, and where do I know I can turn next for additional challenges, needs, and things that might come up. So linkage to collaborative services is often a really important outcome. We'll take a little break around 1:50, and we'll make sure that everybody kind of has a moment to sort of stretch, get a drink of water, and take a short break there. And then when we come back at the end of the day today, we have some breakout room activities planned, and we're also going to talk about a scenario that we will hopefully engage all of you in. Everybody will be encouraged to be involved in, where we're actually going to think through a real PFA case and try to put all the pieces together. We've talked about a lot of different modules over the last couple of weeks. So let's think about what it looks like when we actually tie all this together. How do you take what we've done in the last month, and what does it look like in a 30-minute contact in real life, right? And so let's think through some of those situations and scenarios and challenges together. We'll also save a little bit of time at the end for questions that folks might have about this whole model. And so we're, again, looking forward to kind of wrapping up today with some important information, and we'll talk a bit and hopefully see all of you here again in another month or so when we talk about skills for psychological recovery, kind of the companion piece. So with that, let's go ahead and just start, and we'll begin by talking about core action number 7, which is information on coping. So again, information on coping, like practical assistance and connection with social supports, is one of those sort of optional modules in psychological first aid. So this is one of those that won't necessarily be appropriate for every survivor that you work with, but you may well find that this is one that you end up using quite a bit, actually, because this is one that's really relevant for folks experiencing more intense kind of, distress related to the trauma or the disaster. And so that's often going to be something that I think most folks benefit from to some degree. And I think Dr. Hambrick can certainly speak to this a bit as well when she talks a little bit about linkage to collaborative services, and she may chime in as well when we talk about information on coping. But I often find that I sprinkle a little bit of this in almost every PFA contact that I do. Not always, but fairly often, even when emotional distress may not be the most pressing concern that folks have. It's still often something that's relevant for what a lot of survivors are going through, and relevant for why a lot of survivors engage with us, I think. So let's talk a little bit about information on coping, get a sense for what this looks like, what we mean by this. And I think that as we talk about information on coping in particular today, you'll begin to really see some key differences between psychological first aid and other early interventions like debriefing, right? So we've talked about what debriefing looks like, and we've all kind of talked about the kinds of things that we do when we link folks to critical incident stress debriefing, what that model traditionally has sort of emphasized. And I think this is sort of the piece of PFA that may overlap the most with those kinds of early intervention models. But again, you'll see it's a very different kind of style of talking about distress with folks than maybe what you would do in more traditional debriefing kind of contexts. So let's just dive right in. We'll talk a little bit about information on coping today. And let's just go to the next slide and think about what the goals of this module really are. So the goal of the, of information on coping and trying to share this module with folks is to provide information about stress reactions and coping skills that people can use to try to reduce any immediate distress that they might have, or any sort of residual or ongoing kind of acute distress that folks might be experiencing, and to try to help set the stage for adaptive kind of functioning, right? Helping folks think about what kind of things I've been doing right now, maybe, implicitly, that have been helping me kind of manage my distress, to reflect a bit on maybe things that they've used in the past that could be helpful now in this moment, or to even offer some new ideas, new concepts, and new strategies that might be helpful for folks who are sort of navigating the rocky terrain that often is the emotional distress that we experience in response to disaster and trauma. So that's really the goal here. And again, when we think about why this module is so central to psychological first aid, as we've talked about again and again throughout this ECHO series, traumatic events can be really, really overwhelming for folks, putting people at risk for losing their sense of competence, right? Our sense and our own abilities to be able to handle problems, particularly problems and challenges that may be new for us in entirely new ways that we've never had to confront or deal with before. So I think really, it can be beneficial to a person's recovery if they feel that they can cope with that intense trauma-related emotional distress. And so we want to try to help people have a better sense of the lay of the land. And here's kind of what we know a lot of folks will experience, and here are some ideas and strategies that other folks maybe have found useful along the way. But let's think about what's also been most helpful for you in the past and what strengths you have. So I think it's really kind of a nice way of helping emphasize the strengths that are natural to folks, and kind of takes a very strengths focused kind of approach to how we help with acute distress. So if we go to the next slide, we think about what it is we really want to do here when we do this module in kind of a full way. Really what we want to try to do, and probably the most important piece of providing information on coping to survivors, is that we want to think about providing basic information on stress reactions. So let's just help give folks some information about the kinds of things that they might be experiencing or might experience in the coming days and weeks, right? Or even information on what their kids might be experiencing and going through. Because sometimes we may not necessarily know as a parent, for example, what to expect in terms of how our child's doing. Are they doing okay? Here's what I'm seeing, but I don't know what it necessarily means, right? So just providing some basic information, psychoeducation about the common reactions that people are likely to have, I think often sort of helps give folks a better sense of sort of what's happening, and sort of just helps ground folks and orient them a bit to better understand at a sort of meta level, if you will, what it is they're experiencing. So then we can kind of talk with them a bit about common psychological reactions to traumatic events and losses that they might have experienced. That can include death-related losses and even non-death-related losses, right? If we're talking about loss of resources or other things that folks might need just in terms of basic needs that are often directly impacted in the wake of trauma and disasters. But then we want to just provide, again, some basic tips on ways of coping and teach some simple relaxation skills that hopefully in that moment help the person sort of better feel more prepared and more able to cope with the distress that they're feeling. So again, if we just think about the overall goal here, have some general kind of familiarity with the kinds of reactions that folks are likely going to experience and encounter, share some information about that. We'll talk about how to do that in sort of the most useful way throughout the day today, and in particular in our breakout groups, right? And, how do you kind of share this information in a way that's useful for folks, not too overwhelming, also not pathologizing the kinds of reactions that they may be having. But then here's some tips on some things that you might try to kind of help with that in the moment, to help make each moment a little bit easier, right? To help make each moment seem a little more possible. So that being said, let's kind of think about what kinds of reactions we want to be able to give folks information about, right? So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what kinds of reactions we want to share information about. And you'll notice again that, these are reactions that we've talked about and that we've touched on over the last few weeks together, right? We've kind of talked a lot about what kinds of reactions are completely normal reactions and typical reactions folks might experience in the acute aftermath of a trauma or disaster. And so just having, again, some familiarity about those kinds of reactions to be able to share with folks is really kind of key for this piece here, right? So provide some information about common reactions that folks might be likely to experience. So that includes intrusive reactions. And this is just kind of review, but I think it's a good opportunity for all of us to kind of recap a bit some of the key information that we've shared up to this point. When I say intrusive reactions, again, what am I referring to here? What do we mean by intrusions? It's a very clinical term, right? But like what kind of things are we talking about here? So it's kind of a hint, think back to our very first session, right? So flashbacks, I saw in the chat, somebody said flashbacks, right? Those memories of what you've just gone through, memories of maybe those really intense moments as the trauma or the disaster was unfolding around you. So thoughts kind of, weeding their way into your thoughts and mind, right? Those memories, and they often have a very visual quality to them as well. We remember certain details, and those details can really just evoke a lot of emotional distress, right? So that's what we mean by intrusions. So just understanding that that's a common reaction and being able to sort of help explain that to folks in a developmentally appropriate way can I think really sort of help alleviate concerns that folks may have about even their own reactions and what that means, right? So
I think, Joe, I think it's, I just appreciate that we're spending some time kind of defining these and putting them in these terms, because it's true that most people aren't familiar with the term intrusive reactions,
right.
and even saying that can, saying that
Right.
term directly can be kind of heightening. Like,
Yeah.
I could have an intrusive reaction. I don't even know what that means, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's just great discussion around what do these things really mean, and how would we think about expressing that?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And so sort of as we talk about these kinds of reactions for review here, to Dr. Hamburg's point, in thinking through these examples, kind of start thinking a bit about how you might explain this to a child, to a teenager, to a parent who's concerned about what it's like for their child having these kinds of flashbacks and experiences, right? How do you put this in language in a way that is can be easily sort of received and understood, and most importantly, useful to the folks that you're talking to and working with in these kinds of contexts, right? So we'll kind of talk about all this. And again, I'll refer you to the manual, right? The PFA manual has some great tips on how to do some of this. And so you can always kind of check that out as well. And then, but check that out, right? Yeah, YouTube video on replay, right? I mean, that's kind of a great analogy for some of this. I love that. So just be thoughtful about how you would explain some of this in your own words in a way that people can understand, right? So it's important to understand what intrusions are, right? But also to be thinking about how you would explain them to people in a useful way. But understand that avoidance and withdrawal reactions are also very common, right? And so when we talk about that, not necessarily wanting to talk about what you just went through, right? Not wanting to have conversations about that. Not going near people or places that remind you of what you just went through, right? So those are kind of what we mean when we talk about avoidance and withdrawal. Physical arousal reactions. If you're having lots of those, sort of memories of what you just went through popping into your head over and over again, often that comes with a lot of distress that can include some really intense physical distress, almost panic kinds of symptoms, right? Your heart rate goes up. You may feel kind of shaky or sweaty. So physical arousal is really, really common. And understanding that and being able to explain that to folks who are experiencing those kinds of reactions can be helpful. We talked a few weeks ago about grief reactions and how those are different from trauma-related reactions. And again, this is just kind of a review and recap, but in what ways do folks, at this point kind of think about grief reactions as different from trauma-related kinds of reactions? And what are some key differences there that you might look for and help folks understand? Any thoughts on that? It's actually a tricky one, right? Because, when we think about what we see at the biological level, or at sort of a biological level when we look at acute grief, many of the same neurobiological systems associated with trauma are also activated in grief responses, right? We see activation of sort of the, the HPA axis, that stress, fight or flight response. It's pretty highly aroused and activated in the context of acute grief too. But one of the things that I think can be sort of a hallmark distinction for a lot of folks to understand, right, and to look for and be mindful of, particularly if there was a death-related loss in the context of what the person just experiences, that desire, that yearning to be reunited with somebody. Yearning is a really hallmark feature of grief, right? It's distinct in some ways from what we see with trauma-related reactions, which tend to involve a lot more fear and horror, right? So they're just kind of unique in that way, and that there's some very different kinds of experiences there. Understand some unique features of traumatic grief in particular, right? So maybe where the death was occurred under traumatic circumstances. So in traumatic situations or disaster-related situations where a loved one's death might have involved elements of violence or intentional or occurred as the result of the intentional act of someone else. For example, a lot of times we might see that a person experiences intense guilt. A person might also find that they're sort of, instead of having intrusive images, find that you're sort of really, really thinking a lot about what might have been going on in your loved one's mind, what they might have been thinking or experiencing in their final moments. So there are some unique elements to traumatic grief that sometimes are unique from non-traumatic grief. So just again, kind of be aware of those, and don't be afraid to, refer to your manual, because the PFA manual includes a lot of this information in ways that you can sort of, go back, refer, and share with folks, share with the folks that you're talking to. Depression reactions, right? So depression, again, a little bit, different from what we think of when we think about trauma and grief, but sort of how is depression distinct from all these other reactions and responses? When you think about how depression is different from, acute trauma, with depression, I think the real key is that, instead of there being a lot of intense fear or horror, we just see a lot of really, really overwhelming disengagement and sadness, right? Just the profound sadness that's characteristic of depression in some ways can be a little bit different than what we think of when we think of trauma, right? There's a lot of overlap, certainly, but I think that can be a key feature. So loss of interest, yeah, and someone else said just low mood, right? So those are all things to kind of be on the lookout for.
Well, and in kids,
Yep.
you can see some anger as
yeah,
part of that.
right, absolutely. And that's kind of, leads to the other piece, physical reactions. And by that, thinking about things, that are a little bit different, like your appetite might change. Sleep disturbances might come up for folks, right? You might find that you're just feeling really lethargic, don't have a lot of energy, because it kind of wears the body out coming down from that intense stress response that's characteristic of trauma and disaster. So lots of physical reactions to be on the lookout for and to be mindful of as well. Now, you don't have to know all of these kinds of reactions, and not all of these kinds of reactions are going to be relevant for everybody that you talk to, but understand kind of the range of responses that are certainly normal in the acute aftermath of trauma or disaster. And hopefully when you've started off your PFA contact, doing some contact and engagement, have gotten a broader sense of what was going on for the person at the time that the incident happened or the event happened, and kind of know more about what it is they're experiencing in that moment with you. You can sort of just help draw on what you know about common reactions and kind of help share that information and reassure folks that what they're experiencing, is a common reaction that folks would experience in situations like this, right? And one way that I've heard folks say this that I really like, normal reactions to unnatural or not normal circumstances, right? Which is kind of what we often think of when we think about, just sharing this information with the folks. And so I think just kind of have that filed away in the back of your mind and be prepared to sort of help normalize and share that. So I kind of mentioned all of that here, and I just want to reiterate that I think it is extremely important to sort of know and be prepared how to talk about some of these reactions with folks, because again, and the studies that both my team has been involved in, and then other folks, colleagues that I have around the country who've studied this have sort of been involved in, when you ask survivors what kinds of things they wish that they had had in the immediate aftermath of a trauma or disaster, often folks will tell us, at the time, we just didn't know what to make out of what we were experiencing. It all felt so overwhelming inside, and nobody seemed to understand what was going on. And just having some information from somebody who could just tell us a little bit about what to expect, the course of what was going on, and some ways to manage that would have just helped us feel so much better, right? So I think that, you know, from the survivor's perspective, when we ask people who've lived through these kinds of experiences, what is it that you really wish clinically you had had at that point? A lot of times folks resoundingly will tell us information about the kinds of things that we were going through inside, right? Just having somebody who seems to understand that, or at least could sort of just relate to that in some level, would have meant a lot. So I think that there's really a lot of value in understanding the range of reactions that people often have. And sometimes by just sharing this information, we begin to promote a process of natural recovery without doing anything else beyond that, right? Because we can kind of, again, just help demystify in some ways what folks are going through for them in the moment. So I really think this is an important one to just sort of be mindful of and continue thinking about as you lead this training and get prepared to do this work in your own communities, right? And sort of prepare your own disaster response efforts and initiatives. But with that, you know, we share information on coping with folks. How is this different from debriefing though? And we've talked a bit about debriefing, what's involved in debriefing, and I know some of you are familiar with debriefing style interventions because that's kind of been the thing that we've typically done the most in the past. How is this different from what you might think of when we traditionally do like debriefing style interventions at this point? Some folks are probably more familiar with debriefing models than others. Right, but when we think about debriefing, historically, what early interventions would have done, and somebody here, I saw this pop up, right? Debriefing traditionally has happened days after the event, and that's right? So timing-wise, it kind of fits within the same time frame here. Maybe historically might have occurred a few days after the time when we're talking about doing PFA. But still kind of, you know, they fall in that first like week or so window post-trauma or disaster. But generally when we talk about debriefing, right, yeah, okay, I see somebody here saying debriefing is focused a lot more on exploring a lot of the causes and how people are handling and how people are kind of handling their immediate responses. And I think that's right. So Chad, I appreciate you kind of sharing that. And I think that is a big distinction here. Because with debriefing historically, we'd encourage people to sort of openly process and talk about what are your immediate feelings, thoughts, reactions, and sort of what were they at the time that the event unfolded or at the time that you were notified about what happened, right? If you weren't immediately there yourself. So much more kind of getting into the nitty gritty about what your reactions were to the trauma at the time it happened. And here, when we talk about providing information on coping, maybe we ask in a general way about those kinds of things, but we're not necessarily encouraging people to tell us too much or get too into the details, as much as we just kind of want to know what sort of experiences have been most sort of noticeable for you, and then we can help share some information about those experiences in a way that, again, just help folks understand them as natural responses to what they're occurring, right? So we're not pulling for too much information as much as we are just sort of getting a general sense of where they are and sharing information, right? So it's a little bit different in that way. Now, I thought you said it a great way. I thought it was perfect. But that's really good stuff. And so that's kind of just a key thing here that I think is sort of just, you know, something to be mindful of when you think about some important differences. But ideally, when we do this module, when we do psychological first aid, again, we want to give folks some things to help sort of mitigate the intensity of these reactions as they're telling us about them and as we're sharing information about natural reactions that folks are going to experience. So if we go to the next slide, let's kind of think about what comes next, right? What are the other sort of important goals of this module here? So when we give folks information about what they're experiencing, kind of the other pieces that we want to try to ensure that the person has, you know, 2 or 3 different healthy coping strategies that they can then use to help manage any of these reactions that they may be experiencing, right? Or that they have some coping strategies that they can kind of file away in their back pocket, pull out and use if they notice that some of these reactions start happening, you know, down the road, right? Still good to just help folks kind of have some important coping skills that they can easily draw on. And these are, we're talking, you know, pretty basic, pretty simple things that we can talk about with people in a simple way really quickly in the context of a brief PFA contact. So, we can ask folks to kind of describe what kind of coping strategies are you currently using, or if it's a parent who's really concerned about how their child's doing, for example, what kind of things are you as a family doing to cope, or what kind of things does your child really, seem to be doing or enjoy doing that might help them kind of cope with what they're going through and experiencing. So you can kind of just, get a sense of where people are, what kind of things they're using, and just ensure that they feel confident, right, and feel comfortable in their ability to continue using those strategies. And so that may mean that you want to draw on things that they've used in other stressful times, coping strategies that they feel pretty familiar with and that they have the ability to use. But that being said, sometimes in the aftermath of trauma, what's worked for us before isn't necessarily going to work now. So sometimes we also have to be mindful and prepared and willing to talk through with folks new ideas, right? What are some new things that we can try right now if the other stuff that you've used in the past just doesn't seem to be helping right now or doesn't feel appropriate right now, right? Because people may not want to use coping strategies that they've used in the past, right? There's for different reasons. But let's try to get a sense of maybe what they are doing, what they have done. And then with that, and let's kind of think about then going to the next slide, let's think about just sort of helping brainstorm with folks what kind of things they can do, right? So if the person says that they're not really using any sort of immediate coping strategies, or they're not sure what to do, or they don't feel like things they've done in the past have really and would really be helpful right now in this situation or context, then the PFA manual and the app as well sort of just includes some helpful tips on things that you can suggest. And you don't have to just limit yourself to the things suggested in the manual, right? Get creative, but this just gives you some ideas and kind of helps facilitate dialogue with folks, I think. But, make some recommendations to folks. And again, the manual includes lots of useful recommendations, but try to help give people at least, 2 or 3 things, or leave folks in a place where they feel like they have 2 or 3 different ideas for coping strategies that they feel like they could try using that would likely be helpful in helping them cope with and managing distress. And that can include a lot of different things, right? So just even, talking to somebody else for support. Who can I reach out to and talk to right now that might help me feel a little bit better if I start noticing some of these reactions just, recurring and getting more intense? Encouraging folks just to, again, getting back into routine in whatever way you can, and making sure that even if you're not tired right now, and even if you're not hungry right now, that you're getting as much sleep as possible and still, eating and getting as much nutrition as possible, right? If exercise is part of your regimen, keep doing that as much as possible too, as the opportunity comes along, right? So to the extent that you can get back on routine and just make sure that you're attending to self-care, that's often going to have a really big impact on helping those sort of intense reactions start to naturally recover for most people. But engaging in positive, distracting activities, hobbies, sports, whatever it can be, if you can get back into positive hobbies and activities that, while distracting, are things that you naturally enjoy, that's going to be really helpful for a lot of folks. And again, we've had situations where in these kinds of contexts with folks, you can even just give people like coloring sheets, right? If you're talking about kids or adolescents, give them something to color, right? Just to sit down, distract, and kind of help get your mind off something. Listen to music, whatever it might be. Just kind of help people think about what they can do there. So scheduling pleasant activities, getting back on schedule, relaxation techniques like deep breathing exercises, grounding techniques, meditation kinds of exercises, things that we've also practiced over the last few weeks. Those can be really helpful coping strategies to use when you're giving people some tips at this point in the intervention too. But also encourage people, counseling and support groups can also be a great way to help you sort of continue processing some of this down the road. If you notice that you continue experiencing some of these reactions and they just seem to sort of, they just seem to stay as intense as they are right now, right? Or don't seem to be getting any better, right? So encouraging counseling, additional support can be a really, really helpful thing. And I think particularly getting some additional support in the form of, less intensive early interventions like skills for psychological recovery, which for many people is going to be the next step that you go to after you finish an intervention like psychological first aid. And so we'll again dive into the nitty gritty of SPR here in a month or so. And so I hope to see a lot of you there. That's my plug for that now. But, just be mindful about, thinking about a lot of options. Give folks a menu of options, right? We say a menu of options, just meaning 2 or 3 things that you can try, because you may notice that, relaxation helped a couple of times, but you know what, right now, it's not really helping me out that much, but, maybe doing something else distracting and just knowing that I can do that, or that I can pick up the phone and call somebody else right now if these other 2 things aren't working, that can often lead to better outcomes. And again, help enhance a person's sense of competency in their ability and being able to handle just the intense reactions that are so natural at this point in the aftermath of trauma or disaster. But before we move on to the next module, when Dr. Hambrick's going to talk a little bit about linkage to collaborative services, I want to just also take a moment to remind all of you as future PFA providers to think about how you cope with helping the folks that we have the privilege of working with in these kinds of settings, right? So we're talking here about things you can suggest to the disaster affected families that you're going to be working with one day, or the trauma affected families that you might be working with one day. But as much as we need to talk about ways to help give them tips on coping, I want to encourage all of you to consider, also giving yourself the space to do the same. And so if we go to the next slide, just in thinking about, ways that we can help refresh ourselves, I'd like to just invite us all to pause for a moment and just think about what are some of the rewards of your work. So if we just even took a couple of minutes right now, what are 5 things that really are rewarding to you about being a helping professional? And all of us here are, right? And all the different work that we do and all of our different professional roles, we're all helping professionals. And I think sometimes when we can stop and remember what really is valuable about this work for all of us, it can help us cope with the pain that sometimes comes with being a helper. All right, so let me just encourage all of you, take a couple of minutes, see if you can think of at least 5 things that you find rewarding about your work. And if folks have some ideas, feel free to share. I'd love to hear just a couple of things from folks that come to mind for you before we hand it off to Dr. Hambrick. I can just feel it. There's a groundswell of positive things folks are thinking about their work out there right now. It's just waiting to be shared.
Hi, this is Lisa Stonehouse.
Hey, Lisa.
And I'm in a different category than most of the other participants of this because I'm not in the mental health profession. I'm a senior director for a child care and Head Start, and I've got terrible allergies, so I hope you can hear me.
In your position, you're definitely a helper.
Yeah, well, I don't anymore provide services, so my focus is like on my staff. And because my staff are basically my children now in my role. What we come across is the constant of, I've tried that, it don't work. I've tried that, it don't work. I've tried that, it don't work. And, we know that it takes a long time to create new habits. Bad habits are easy to pick up right away. Healthy, good habits are extremely difficult to put into your everyday life. So that's one thing that we struggle with is I kind of just call them a little negative Nelly, but what I think is beneficial in regards to the question, what is rewarding? We talk a lot of times about we plant seeds, but we may never see the blossom. Yeah. So we plant the seeds in these children and the families, and then they leave us, after a couple years, and we may never get to see the blossom. And that's something that is really hard, kind of like with that immediate gratification kind of mentality that society has now, that, we want to see that we're doing good and we want to see that benefit right away. And just making sure that my staff understand and I understand that, we're implanting those little bits and pieces of things, and it's up to the families and the children to implement them. But what I do appreciate with my job is that we do follow-ups. Once the kiddos leave us, we contact them at 3rd grade to see how everything is going. And that's when we get to see the blossoms.
Yeah.
And so people that work in your field, it would be hard to never, at least we know that we might get to see the blossom eventually, but knowing that you got, how do you deal with yourself? How do you deal with that? Not knowing if you're ever going to see this blossom or not, or the follow-up from, patients and clients that you've seen, and now you don't know where they're at. We struggle with that because we get very connected.
Yeah. Yeah. It's something that you struggle with, but at the same time rewarding when you do get to see that impact. And it's rewarding just knowing that often, even when we don't see it, we really are potentially changing the trajectory of someone's life in a very important and meaningful way.
And you don't want to sound cliche, but you are making a difference.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. And I wonder if maybe one other person would like to share something rewarding about your work and what you find rewarding.
I'll share what I put in in the chat. So I work for the University of Kansas Health System based out of Hayes. I work with the Telebehavioral Health Network. And I think one of the biggest things, the biggest rewards for me with the work I do is hearing our patients tell us repeatedly how thankful they are for our services in rural Western Kansas and the ease of access they have in their local clinics to our providers there in Kansas City, and how thankful they are that they don't have to travel out of town, be it an hour or even 30, 45 minutes to receive care.
Yeah. It's rewarding knowing that you're removing some real barriers.
Yeah. Yes, very.
Yeah. Yeah. So I appreciate that. And again, I hope that others, I'm sure others were kind of thinking about some great things too, but I would encourage you in the same way that we want to leave the folks that we work with some strategies to help them cope. Always be reflective or invite yourself to periodically come back and be reflective on what really is rewarding about this humbling but important opportunity all of us have. So with that, I'm going to pass this along to Dr. Hambrick. Because these contacts again often serve an important bridge, and that they can be a big way, or an important way of helping connect trauma and disaster survivors to care at the next level, whatever that might be and whatever that might mean. And so Dr. Hambrick's going to talk with us about the next sort of important and final module that we'll talk about before we start doing some of our wrap up and do a lot of role play and discussion and case-based learning. Talk a little bit about linkage to collaborative services. So I'll pass it off to you.
All right, sounds good. So we've made it to our final core action. And again, just as a review, these core actions do not all have to be used, and they do not have to be used in this order. But this is the last one that we haven't yet discussed. So next slide, please. Linkage with collaborative services can be so important, and it can also be a little bit tricky, because we've talked in this training about how we are not trying to pathologize what is happening in the lives of people who are in this acute phase following exposure to disaster or other sorts of traumas. At the same time, we do not want to miss opportunities to ensure that people who could benefit from short-term or long-term services receive them. We don't want to miss that opportunity. So the goal here is to link individuals with available services that they might need right now, that they might need acutely, but also that they could potentially need at a future time point. this is also kind of a way to provide some continuity. So we've talked about how connection to social support is so key. For some people, the people that they meet following a trauma exposure, while they may have only known them for an hour or for a day, that connection can actually feel very, very strong, perhaps stronger than someone they've known in a much less emotionally charged situation for a much longer amount of time. So if you've really had an encounter with someone in this acute phase, it's likely that it was quite meaningful. It's likely that it is something that they will remember. Someone cared for me, they were there for me during this time of need. And you might be particularly poised, considered as particularly trustworthy in some way, such that that individual will really want to continue to receive services either from you or someone like you. Moving to the next slide. So similar to what we talked about with information on coping, often it can be really helpful to get a sense, perhaps when you're information gathering, about, well, what types of services has this individual relied on, benefited from in the past? Are they still connected to those? And we just need to think about maybe making sure they have a contact with them relatively soon, or maybe they're not really actively engaged in those, but now would be a good time to kind of remind them or reorient them to things that have helped in the past so that they can get those back on board again, right? So we know that people who have a history of prior trauma at times are at more risk of having a negative reaction to a current trauma, just because, right, one bad thing happened and then another. That can be really hard in terms of someone's worldview, their perceptions of safety, for example. So is this an individual who's benefited from and enjoyed mental health services in the past? And where is this individual in terms of their connection with that resource? Is that prior therapist perhaps still available? Maybe they're at a new location, but you could help the person Google that new location and think through things like, how might I contact them and let them know what has happened? Medical services, spiritual support, alternative healers, school supports, right? There are all sorts of different supports, not just mental health services. So I think it's also important that we keep that broad umbrella in mind, that we're not just thinking, how do I link them to mental health services? How do I link them to mental health services? But what has been there for them in the past, and how could we think about getting them access? This can be especially tricky when a disaster affects an entire community, right? Because if a disaster affects an entire community, people who were previously supports for this individual might have also been affected by the disaster. That doesn't mean that they're not willing or able or even excited to be a resource for people that they've worked with in the past, but it could mean that there might be some additional barriers to think through when the impact has been at the community scale. Next slide. Again, we want to be really careful here, because some people have different beliefs about the utility of mental health services, whether or not they can trust mental health and or medical providers, and that those feelings are all valid. And so as a psychological first aid provider, you never want to come across as having an agenda that because you've experienced this, you must connect with mental health services. While at the same time, sometimes there are individuals that maybe required a lot of intense stabilization following the disaster, that maybe have had lots and lots of questions about how to help their children, for example, cope with these overwhelming experiences. That maybe there's just been some indicators to you as the psychological first aid provider that this is probably an individual or a family or a child that could benefit for some mental health services. So if you have kind of thrown that softball. Some people, even in the early phases, like to think forward and think to the future and think, might I be interested in some mental health services to help me cope with this experience? And should I go ahead and get the ball rolling now, right? We all know that in some places there are wait lists, right? So the earlier you reach out and get on an agency's radar, the sooner that services might be available to you. And if that individual kind of comes back and says, we don't really, that's not really something of interest to us. We had a bad experience one time. I think there can be a variety of reasons why people might kind of say no. Some additional things that you could say might be to suggest an evaluation instead of treatment, or to kind of describe the process. Lots of people who reach out to mental health services following a trauma just meet with somebody one time to see if there are any services that could be useful to them. It doesn't have to be a long-term thing. I think normalizing the idea of treatment, providing information about local mental health providers that are community embedded, and also offering other resources, not just kind of giving the perspective that it's mental health or bust that's going to get you through this. In fact, there are a variety of community-based supports that could be very helpful. Okay, next slide. Just some possible indicators of the need for a referral that I think can be good to think about. Again, individuals who required lots of stabilization, who required some medication management perhaps, or medical support in that early period post-disaster. When pastoral counseling is desired, right? When someone wants to connect with someone whose spiritual beliefs are congruent to their own. If, let's say that you are maybe not in that acute aftermath, but maybe you met with somebody early on and now it's 4 to 6 weeks after the disaster and they are still experiencing lots and lots of distress and disruption in their daily routine. When there's significant developmental concerns about children and adolescents, maybe really significant regression, parents are having trouble kind of leading the family through daily tasks. Also, when they ask for a referral, it is, this is one of the reasons why we always say an expert from out of town is really not the right person to be providing psychological first aid. It's so important for people who are providing PFA to be embedded within the community and to be aware of local resources. And if you're not immediately aware, to kind of know, how would I become aware? Who would I ask in my community about this type of resource, so that I can get some really practical names and numbers in the hand of an interested individual as quickly as possible, while the interest is there. Okay, next slide. And kind of a final thing that I'll, two final things that I'll say. One thing that I think is really important when you're trying to connect an individual with resources is to do what you can to help the person engage in behaviors that kind of put them on the path towards service receipt, right? So maybe you have a person encourage them to put a number in their phone and save it as a contact. Maybe you encourage a person or sit with them while they look at the psychologytoday.com website that lists different providers and the types of insurances that they take. Maybe you sit with them while they make a call and help them think through the types of questions to ask to see if a provider that they might like to see is available at a certain location. So I think anytime you can be there and observe a behavioral step toward linkage, you've really kind of hit a home run in terms of providing psychological first aid. And a final thing that I want to say here, this, I guess it's a quote, I probably should have put the page number, but this comes verbatim from the Psychological First Aid Manual. We've talked about how just in the course of providing psychological first aid, sometimes people will just tell you things. as a psychological first aid provider, it's not our job to pry or pull for information, oh, tell me exactly what happened. And oh my goodness, you must have been so distressed, that sort of thing. But social sharing is very, very common, especially in the face of shared disasters where people have had a common experience. And so remember that children and adolescents can have a difficult time telling and retelling information related to traumatic events. And so if they have trusted you with information, it can be really nice, again, in collaboration with their parents and in full transparency about what you're writing down and who's going to have access to it. But sometimes it can be nice to help develop kind of a one-pager that they could even bring to a helping person so that they don't have to repeatedly, every time they pick up the phone, every time they talk to somebody at the next helping agency, say over and over and over again what has happened to them. And I think that for people who desire that type of support, it can actually be a really big gift. All right, so we'll move along to the next slide, which I believe is our break. So we will take a 5-minute break here. And when we come back, we will get into our breakout rooms. We'll slowly start to welcome everybody back. So thank you again for being with us throughout this 4-part series. We're now starting hour 8. We're so honored to have you all spend your time here, and really look forward to in the future hearing about any potential impact at the community level. For our final breakout room session, we are going to focus mostly on the information on coping core action. And when you get into your room, we are going to do an exercise focused on thinking through how we might describe potential common reactions that young children, school-age children, and/or adolescents might experience following exposure to a disaster, right? How might we really think about having that conversation in ways that are brief and that avoid jargon, but that also empower individuals and help individuals even get a sense of safety and comfort from the simple fact that they now know what to expect, right? Trauma can take control away, and a way that we can give it back to individuals is by giving them knowledge and helping prepare them for what they might expect in the coming days. So with that, I'll let Christy go ahead and send out the breakout room invitations. That Joa oriented us earlier to, what are really rewarding aspects of your job. And for me, just seeing the questions that you all had, I mean, you probably would have had those same great questions before this training, but at the same time, it's exciting for me to see the ideas that you all are generating related to what you might want to know and what you might want to do if your role was to be a PFA provider. So thanks for all of your great engagement there. Want to leave about 1 minute here. Does anybody have a question that you have just never had the moment to ask before we do a final word cloud to close this out? Oh, it's kind of loud on my computer. Well, please know, I think that our contact information is available in some way, shape, or form through the emails that we send out, and we would enjoy to continue to be a resource for you as you engage in this work. So, please feel free to reach out. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So, before we get to our word cloud, our final wrap up here is, again, we will be sending you a survey today, and we appreciate your feedback so very much, especially as we fine tune the Skills for Psychological Recovery training that again starts on July 14th. We hope you will join us. Joa gave a little bit of a teaser in terms of what you will learn, and really what you will learn is, okay, someone's having this issue. This is kind of at the top of their list. How do we help them, regardless of whether or not they have a diagnosis, come up with ways to cope with that problem? So it gets more individualized, and it is a bit of a deeper dive. We also have another echo unrelated to disaster, but I guess depending on the severity of the food allergy, on managing food allergies, there's an echo starting up on August 6th. So with that,
echo focuses on any school staff, not just school nurses, but anyone who may interact with a child that in an emergency would need an EpiPen.
So yeah, maybe not so unrelated. How do you give an EpiPen in a stressful situation, right? Okay, so let's move to the final word cloud. So Christy or Robert or someone just put the word cloud link in the chat. So go ahead and click on that link, the https://poll.ev link that you see in the chat. And we would just like to see a word that describes something you will take with you from this Echo series now that our time together is complete. Wow, I love seeing confidence here. How I'm interpreting that is that you're leaving with some confidence in terms of doing this work. If I'm way off base, you can say that in the chat, but if that's what you're taking with you, then I'm extremely glad to hear about that. We really want these skills to be things you can use immediately. I like seeing calm. You know, we were talking in our breakout room about how the sense of safety in many respects begins with the people who are doing the providing, and how we speak, how we stand, what our body language is like. How do we spread a message that you are safe and there are resources available to you? Person first. I love to see that. Well, thank you all so much for participating in this final activity. And as usual, this will kind of get fed back to you all as well. And with that, that concludes our psychological first aid training. Again, we hope to hear from you in the surveys that we send out and hear about ways that you've used these skills, and stay on connected through the SPR trainings if you're available. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and we appreciate seeing you and hope to see you in future echoes and trainings. Have a good week and hope to see you in July.